Thanks for joining our last Building Connections webinar of 2021. As we wind down this year, we at CASEL are feeling so much gratitude for each of you and for your commitment to social and emotional learning. Throughout this webinar series, we've explored how social and emotional learning can support many priorities. And though your specific goals may look different from community to community, I know that today's topic on teacher well-being is top of mind for anyone working in education right now. This school year, we've seen most of the country return to in-person school, which has created more room for relationship building and for renewed focus on social, emotional, and academic learning. We've also continued to feel the incredible challenges that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And it's no surprise that concerns are rising around teacher burnout and well-being. If you've been implementing SEL systemically in the school system, you know that in order to fully support students' social, emotional, and academic learning, adults themselves need to feel supported, valued, and connected. That's why a key area of focus for SEL implementation is around creating structures that support adults socially, emotionally, and professionally. With adult SEL, there's been a lot of attention to strategies for teacher self-care or stress management. But we know that this individual level of focus is not enough. Just like student SEL, a focus on adult SEL also has to consider what systems-wide conditions and structures are in place that promote a culture of wellness. That's why I'm excited to hear from our presenters today, who will offer long-term strategies that help us create a systems-wide shift to prioritize the well-being of all educators. Now, I'd like to welcome our presenters. Dr. Olga Acosta-Price is Director of the Center of Health and Healthcare in Schools at the George Washington University Milken Institute School of Public Health, where she provides leadership on the development and quality of school health services across the US. Dr. Doris A. Santoro is Professor of Education at Bowdoin College and studies educators' moral and ethical concerns about their work. She is the author of Demoralized: Why Teachers Leave the Profession They Love and How They Can Stay. Welcome to both of our presenters.
Thank you so much, Pamela. Doris and I are so honored to be with you all today, and do wish you sort of a successful end of your semesters and end of your calendar year, and are really excited to talk about some of these issues that we feel so strongly about and know that you do too. Before we sort of dig into what we want to share with you and what we want to hear from you, I'm going to advance to the next slide. We would love for you to take a second to respond to the poll questions that are going to be coming up any moment. Just a quick snapshot, yes and no is all that's required, and we'll just want to get a sense of how you're feeling and how important some of these issues are for you right now. So we'll give you about a minute or so to 30 seconds to answer the questions.
We'll give it about 5 more seconds. About 80% of you have already responded, so thank you.
Excellent, excellent. And I'll say a shout out to my DC schools who I see in the chat. So happy that you're here.
All right.
So good. Let's take a look. Wow. Almost 100% of you really concerned about educator wellness and burnout, and only slightly less about demoralization. So we definitely appreciate hearing from you. Know this is critical area for all of us, and we will be talking shortly to help maybe distinguish the nuances, kind of the differences between these concepts, and hope to unpack them a little bit. Moving on to the next slide. Before we get into that, we wanted to share a little bit about our respective areas of work and And I'll share about my center as well as being a faculty member in the School of Public Health. I am honored to be the director of the Center for Health and Healthcare in Schools, which is a national applied research, translational science, and resource center. We work with school communities around the country and their partners to really together try to implement strong, effective, sustainable strategies to promote effective school health programs, policies, and practices, so that we're really reaching all students, all members of the school community. We have a number of resources. Again, as a traditional, more technical assistance and resource center, we have created and vetted and culled many different resources that have been developed with a particular eye towards the types of interventions or strategies that can be used to address what may be considered some of the drivers of the conditions in which teaching occurs, in which learning is occurring, and that really tend to, and trying to dismantle those in an effort to promote better health promoting environments. I would welcome any visits to our website and any of the resources that are there. Moving on, and I'll turn it to Doris to say hi.
Thank you, Olga, and thanks to everyone at Castle for making this possible today. I'm joining you from Maine, home of the Wabanaki Confederacy, and I am a philosopher of education. I am a teacher educator. I am a former teacher, and while I was on sabbatical last year, I was a volunteer substitute teacher. And I study teachers' ethical and moral concerns about their work. I am white, and I have recently been teaming with educators of color and researchers of color to investigate the sources of demoralization in educators of color. And I'm especially proud of some work I very recently completed for the Portland, Maine public schools, where we were able to interview over 50% of the educators of color in the school and to understand how to better improve their work conditions. I'm currently working with a team of building leaders to think about how to cultivate anti-racist professional cultures in schools. I'm also working with another team of researchers studying demoralization and the conditions that supported teacher well-being during the beginning of the pandemic, and that is through Virginia Commonwealth University. And so that's based on survey data. So I'm very excited to be here with you today and to be here with my colleague, Dr. Olga Acosta-Price. And so we can go to the next slide. And so Olga and I have come together because we were brought together, and it was incredibly fortuitous because our work, we've both become friends, colleagues, and our work really complements each other. And what we have done is to create a research brief for Ed Research for Recovery that is being hosted through the Annenberg Institute at Brown University. And so we know, that there are teacher shortages and teacher retention has been on folks' minds. It is becoming crucial that we think about educator well-being, but it has not been the focus of many systemic studies. In fact, it's still very difficult to find any studies about educator well-being that doesn't instrumentalize it to only think about the ways in which it impacts student academic achievement. I know that I'm speaking to a group of people who recognize that that is incredibly short-sighted. But what Olga and I have done in this brief is to pull together all of the research and our practice-based knowledge existing knowledge that we could find to help especially decision makers in education think about how to create conditions in schools and in districts that support educator well-being. In this, and we're going to talk about in a minute, that we make a couple of major conceptual distinctions, particularly about moving from thinking only about burnout to thinking about burnout and demoralization. And we move from thinking about only self-care to thinking about a systems and school-wide notion of health and well-being. The other thing I want to note, and we're going to provide a link to this brief in the supplemental resources you'll receive, but one of the things that we want to note is that our findings are not earth-shattering, but we want to note also that these findings are supported by research. And some of the strategies that we really focus on are a culture of mutual trust, teacher involvement in decision-making, and in particular, I'll talk about in just a second, the ways in which we need to respect educators, both their expertise, their autonomy, and their identities. We can go to the next slide. So one of the things we want to call out in this conversation that we have today is that we know that educators of color are already underrepresented seriously in our teacher ranks and overrepresented in attrition. And we know that they have felt the effects of COVID and the so-called anti-CRT movement keenly. And so we have been highlighting the ways that we want to particularly address how, if we are serious about continuing to support educators of color and retain educators of color and attract new educators of color, we need to create school conditions that make it possible for them to thrive. And that means recognizing and supporting their identities. That means creating cultures where social justice is the norm, where it is about inclusivity is a top priority. And so we also just want to note that while our brief mentions teacher well-being, for Olga and me, it's important to talk about educator well-being because at the paraprofessional ranks, we have many more educators of color that are represented at what we would consider the teacher ranks or maybe other kinds of roles in schools. So we want to make sure that we are as inclusive as possible and to recognize the educative role that all of these folks are playing in schools. And we can go to the next slide. So we're, again, as I said, we're going to ask you to think about two major conceptual shifts. And the first conceptual shift that I invite us to think about is the problem of the burnout narrative as the only narrative we have for why teachers leave work they love. Excuse me, pardon me. So one of the things I made this little collage that you can see on the left of your screen. I'm going to cough and mute myself for 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. I made this little collage on the left of my screen, and that was just easily taken from where do we see burnout? And it is everywhere. And I'm particularly, fond of the, sort of crying teacher that is infantilized, right, on the right of that, where the sense of like, okay, so what's wrong with teachers? Well, I want to shift that thinking because that connects to what I think of as that candle metaphor. And I want us to, when we think about burnout, I really want us to think about, what that means. That means that a person's resources have completely worn out. They have nothing left to give. And there's no bringing that back. And I, sometimes think about that as like, if I bring my nice scented candle home and I'm irresponsible with it and I just let that, burn for however many hours because I'm enjoying it so much, then it's kind of on me because I didn't, conserve it in the way it was. And so one of the problems I see with the burnout narrative is that it sets the problem on the person of the teacher who perhaps didn't set appropriate boundaries or didn't engage in enough self-care. And I want to note that boundaries and self-care are incredibly important. And there's something that I, make sure that I am including in my own teaching practice. But that's not the only thing that needs to happen. We need to look at the concept of demoralization that I think is better represented by the overturned turtle. And so demoralization is what I consider a moral form of teacher dissatisfaction or despair. It is rooted in discouragement born out of ongoing value conflicts with pedagogical policies, reform mandates, and school practices. And so demoralization can take the form of feeling complicit in harming students, the community, or the profession, or no longer being able to access the moral rewards of the work. So an example of that is the first could be thinking about, okay, I am being told that no matter what, everyone needs to sit for this exam. And I'm watching a student sob and I can't do anything to intervene. That could be feeling complicit in harm. And being not able to access the moral rewards of my work, maybe I'm thinking about, I really value when I'm able to connect students to the curriculum. But if I have a scripted curriculum now, I don't have any room to make those connections and be flexible. One other thing that I've really noticed that I want to highlight is in interviewing educators of color, I have found that demoralization can also be in effect when teachers and or their students are disregarded as moral agents and persons, accorded with moral legitimacy as a result of social inequities that exist in schools and societies. So when it is, and I think maybe many of you are familiar with Lisa Delpit's Skills and Other Dilemmas of a Progressive Black Educator. And I think that sort of classic article is a great example of that. Lisa Delpit was making moral claims that were based on her commitments and her expertise. And she was completely disregarded by her white colleagues about what she knew about what her Black students needed. And I think I wish that I could say, oh, that was 30 years ago, it's in the past, but is very much still alive and present now. So remoralization is possible, but just like this tortoise can't right itself on its own. And that's why we need to have changes in systems and policies and practices and cultures in order to have that tortoise be righted. It's not just an individual or inside job. It has to be more than just the self. It has to be the system. And I'm going to turn that over to Olga. But the last thing I want to say is that I also really like this tortoise image because it gets to the kind of ageism and misogyny that's also underlying the burnout discourse. Because in what other profession that isn't women dominated do we think that someone becomes less good at their work as they have more experience? And what does it mean to think that someone's used up, and can only like bring out those dusty, dittos, if you even remember what a ditto is, or Xerox copies. I think that there's something in that burnout metaphor that is connected with ageism and misogyny. Okay, Olga, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Doris. We love presenting together because even though we've heard each other speak a number of times, every time we do, I think it just enlightens us more and deepens our understanding. If you can move to the next slide. So I think a complementary set of arguments or discussion is that in our effort to address burnout, which is real, which we don't minimize as being very present across our teaching professions and our educator roles. My center and a lot of our work is really focused on what are the strategies that we could bring to bear, both evidence-based and practice-informed, that can help us ameliorate the impact of these very stressful and oftentimes even now adversarial kinds of conditions in which educators are working. And often the conversation has stopped at ways that we can promote within the individual better knowledge, prioritization of their own self-care. And certainly I will be the first to say that we often do need reminders of how important it is to take care of ourselves. The metaphor of, that's used in airplanes, that we talk about putting our oxygen mask on first before we put it on someone else. I do truly believe that that is the case. And educators who often go into the profession because, again, as Doris said, sort of the values and the moral sense of passion to give to others often means that they will very naturally put others before themselves. So it is an important conversation to continue, but I think it is very potentially harmful to end the conversation right there. And that in addition, that we know this from public health, that health status is more highly predicted by other factors in the environment, by social and environmental conditions, than the actual health care itself. And so similarly, we can apply that same knowledge and understanding to what is our self-care dialogue, which again have limited many districts and schools and SEAs and LEAs alike to really feel at a loss for how they can think more comprehensively about what could be done to not only remind individuals of the importance of the choices that we make and of the responsibility we have, but as Doris said, it can put the sole responsibility for our self-care on the individual, on the person who actually feels many times powerless to make the kinds of changes because the conditions are such that they don't allow you to not only take on those choices, but actually maintain those choices and those behaviors long term. What we want to shift to is also thinking about how to create health promoting environments. How do we make schools and the school milieu one in which we are creating a culture, as Doris said, of safety, of inclusiveness, of engagement, of creativity, and one in which is true for all beings in the school, both educators, staff, and students and families. And so often I like to think about, schools are very familiar with a multi-tiered system of approach. It's something that we apply very easily and create structures around to think about as we think about the risks and the challenges that students have and bring and are facing. We can use a similar strategy as we think about how would we want to organize, what kinds of structures, norms, practices can we be promoting across the school in a way that actually then can dismantle and even fill in gaps where we can create a norm around these practices that promote personal self-care. Next. And we're so pleased to see in, even as you know, the Castle framework, and I'm sure are very familiar with it, and sort of an evidence-based framework, and then to also reference and refer to their school-wide indicators of school-wide SEL and how to really implement it across an entire school system or school building. And when you reference and look at some of the guidance from those documents, and you'll see that one of the main indicators really addresses the need for adult SEL, right? And of course, we're going to include, all adults in that. And I really wanted to just pull out this quote because it very much aligns with our thinking that it's critically important that school-wide SEL implementation intentionally nurtures a work environment in which staff feel supported, empowered, able to collaborate, build relational trust, and develop their social and emotional skills. Much is yet to be established about how to support this development strategically and systematically. And so we really here in many ways are in a conversation with you and are eager to hear about the kinds of strategies that you know about, that you have been advocating for, that you have been implementing. Because as Dora said, there is not a lot that is available easily for us to reference in terms of research studies or even practice guides that will tell us how do we do this work and what are the steps that one should take. Next slide. So the brief really kind of summarizes a number of strategies or the elements, the kind of foundational parts of elements, whatever those strategies are, that if we keep fundamentally some of these principles in mind are really what we're trying to get at. Creating a culture of mutual trust and respect. We hear so much from educators that part of what feels demoralizing is that they are not treated as the contributors, very valued contributors of their own environment, and that they don't have talents and skills beyond in addition to the talents that they bring in the classroom and share with their students, but that they have other leadership skills, they have other insights and perspectives, and that they don't feel often that leaders are tapping into those in a way that allows them to be a part of the solution, to be a part of solving some of the problems that are impacting them day to day. So how do we do that? How do we create opportunities? You know, what I've been so heartened by the fact that as burned out as educators are, I have many examples I can point to of educators who are taking on additional responsibilities because they feel moved to be a part of the solution. They have ideas that their leaders and colleagues have said, yes, would you be willing to be a part of that? It's a great idea, let's try it. And they are jumping in. Again, there is no extra time anywhere for anyone. And yet again, when they are asked to bring those talents and ideas, folks feel very motivated to do so. And creating opportunities for that to be regularly implemented is important. Demonstrating school-wide commitment to social and racial justice and affirming identities. We certainly have called out the importance of racial and ethnic identity, but there are many identities and many of us have multiple identities. And we know that having affinity groups, having opportunities to feel like you can kind of let your hair down and be in a trusted environment to talk about how the intersection of those is impacting us on a day-to-day basis is so healing, can be so transformative. But where are those spaces? How do we create the spaces for educators to find and be allowed to participate in those spaces? Protecting educators' time and prioritizing their learning. These are learning environments. Young people are not the only ones learning. We're continually learning from each other. And that is, again, part of what draws individuals to these professions. As I said, I constantly feel like I'm learning from Doris. I'm learning from my colleagues in DC. And I love that. It's what keeps me energized. It's what feeds me. But we are stripping that away from individuals by not allowing that learning to happen, as if there's only sort of a one-way direction of that. And facilitating involvement, as I said, in the design and implementation of that learning. What would be the best way to do that? And that's going to vary community by community, school by school. So it's so important at the last point here that we're promoting open communication with educators, collecting information, that there has to be true bi-directional communication channels. It is not just about these are the decisions being made by the district or by the school leader. That is important given the environment that we're in, regulations and laws and things related to COVID, into mitigating the spread of the virus. Certainly there's a lot of reporting out that needs to happen around that, and those have to be regular and clear communication. But we also have to build the communication channel from educators to leaders and to others. Again, not just because they have incredible ideas and solutions that they want to share, but just their perspective on what's working, what's not working, why, how we can adjust it. And having those regular channels will only improve the conditions in which educators are working. So investing, whether that's surveys that are being done, whether that's embedded in all the faculty or staff meetings that you're doing, whether it's in one-on-one conversations, but the fact that we're committed and that there is an investment in transparent communication is really important. Why were those decisions made? How are they made? When can we give you feedback on whether it's really working? And when would you solicit other ideas that may be brought to bear? We also highlight some things that we suggest you avoid doing. The strategies we think are counter to the points we're trying to make. Really looking at an approach and a wellness strategy that are essentially superficial, that really are one-offs, that are not sustained or sustainable, but again, and are not informed by those who you're really working with, and avoiding these sort of siloed short-term goals or prescribing processes and policies that are going to ultimately impact teachers, educators, and students without their direct involvement. Next slide, please. So we're just going to quickly spend a few minutes telling you about some examples we've been able to learn about, hear about, be involved in, and then want to really turn to invite you to share. Quickly, I have a couple of examples from DC. I'm so pleased to be a part of such a vibrant community in Washington, DC. We have 250 public schools, both half of which are part of DC public schools, the other half which are, many of them, independent LEAs, charter schools. One of which is Brea Public Charter School, which in its effort to really take teacher well-being and educator well-being very seriously, took the recommendation from one of their staff to expand and really protect a role that is dedicated solely to family engagement and educator wellness, and where they are taking a very holistic approach to wellness, everything from certainly emotional well-being, but also spiritual well-being, financial well-being, and ways that those strategies aren't just being identified, but actually being put into action. There's someone responsible, there's accountability structures, there's regular communication, there's input channels and output. And that group has seen an incredible success related to satisfaction and well-being measures and just the promotion of really innovative ideas. Secondly, we have another school in DC that in 2019 leadership decided that they would pilot a partnership with one of our universities here, and actually in addition to, or actually instead of expanding mental health services and therapeutic services that would be available to their students, actually created a partnership where they funded a clinician to come in 1 day a week dedicated solely to their educators, so that educators could participate in confidential, individual, or group therapeutic services. What they found was 50% of those educators ran to participate in those. They remained. There was very little attrition in those therapeutic services. And not only the outcomes have been really tremendous in terms of self-reported well-being, but also the level of attrition of the educators was cut more than in half as compared to schools in our own district. That I know that teacher retention is a very big issue. Lastly, I'll share a framework that is, again, reflective of a commitment being done at our state education office, the Office of the State Education in DC. And this framework, which is a little icon, but we certainly can share the link so that you can see it, is really a way that they are putting a stake in the ground around the importance of addressing educator wellness as a whole school approach, and really talking about how to do that for the individual at the organizational level, and the commitments that they are making to identify the kind of strategies that will promote that. I'm going to turn to Doris, who will share a few more examples.
Thank you, Olga. And it's been really exciting that even since we wrote our brief, there are a number of examples that are coming coming to light. One that I'm really thrilled by is in the Portland, Maine public schools where I've been doing work. One of the things that happened is as a result of as part of the rollout of this Educators of Color report we created about their experiences at the work, what we did is we held affinity group reflection sessions. And as a great example of a district really listening to teachers and embracing bidirectional communication, the teachers of color and the educators of color in those reflection sessions said, reflection sessions are not enough. We need healing sessions. And so the district brought in a licensed clinical social worker to meet with educators of color in the district to have those kinds of healing circles that were also enabling some of the educators of color to be leaders in that space. Another thing that the district has done is in Maine, it's a very white state, but Portland is not very white. One of the challenges is finding clinicians who either have culturally responsive or competent practices, or who are people of color themselves. And the district has been leveraging its resources to support educators of color who want to access those services. Something that just came across my desk yesterday was Sharif El-Meki's work through the Center for Black Educator Development. And that is being sponsored by the Pennsylvania Department of Education. And this is not just about recruiting educators of color. It's about supporting them, and it is about district-wide and school-wide practices. This is systemic. There are worksheets, and we have included that in the resources that will be provided to you after this session. I'll turn it back to you, Olga.
Thank you. So the next slide, please. So now we really want to hear from you. We really wanted to make sure we left some time. And what we'll do is we're going to pose a couple of questions that we'd love for you to respond in the chat. And we'd love to kind of call out some of them. And this is both sort of questions, but then really, I think, thinking about these also in terms of calls to action. So the first, really, if you consider yourself, identify as an educator, a staff, or practitioner, what do you feel your building or district leaders need to hear about the strategies necessary to improve your well-being? What are some of the things that you feel that if you had their ear and they were really listening, you would want to make sure that they knew and understood about what is happening and what is undermining educator well-being? Would you take a moment and write in the chat? Thank you. It's so true. They need to hear that if we don't take care of educators, we don't take care of kids. That's true. One of the things that we've been hearing repeatedly, and you have some links to other articles that have quoted a number of educators, is they don't feel cared for in their environments. They don't feel that others are caring about the stresses, the worries, the anxieties that educators are carrying, in addition to the fact that they are going above and beyond in doing their jobs. That safety should be a priority, absolutely. And that folks are very worried about that. Eliminating or maximize the grind culture as something to aspire to, absolutely. This sense that we need to work until we are, laying on the ground, that we need to produce and produce and produce, is a culture that is, I think, very much celebrated as part of our culture, as sort of part of this American culture that, again, can work against both self-care practices and the kinds, and it very much is embedded as an expectation in many of our roles. recognize all the demands that are placed on educators. Doris, feel free to chime in if there's any that you want to call out also. But right there, it's beyond the roles and responsibilities as documented, in position descriptions and what's expected. There are many more responsibilities and tasks that educators take on, many of which are not recognized, but really are helping to keep everything moving forward. And oftentimes folks want to feel at least acknowledged, appreciated for the many roles and ways that they're filling in gaps. Lots of stuff in the chat. Educators are not disposable part of the system. Absolutely.
Thank you. These are so valuable to hear this. And Olga, whenever you're ready, we can move to the next
one. Yeah, there's a lot. So I won't be able to.
You can keep going. Don't feel like as we're moving on that you need to stop writing what you are trying to say. Go ahead, Olga. I'll mute.
No problem. All right. So now for everyone, this is for everyone. And again, we'll make sure that we will review and look at all the chat. And then again, one of the global calls to action is, as part of the evaluation that we're going to ask everyone to do, is if you are interested in identifying yourself, being a part of additional conversations, sharing more details about this, we absolutely want to hear from you, and there'll be an opportunity for you to let us know how to contact you. So the second question is, what is your district doing that you want to share? What are some bright spots? What are some examples of that are coming from you that either you're advocating for, that you're helping to implement, that you've seen or heard of, that you want to make sure others know about? We've heard of districts that are really examining. I know a lot have done this around additional, mental health days for not just students, but for educators and staff. I know that there's been some controversy around how that gets implemented and the burdens that may place on caregivers in homes. But again, when communication has been prioritized, I think that there have been cases where that has been another strategy, but really implementing them as part of employee benefits ongoingly, and not just as a short-term solution. Let's see if there's any, and Doris, feel free to unmute if there's any you want to call out. This is like the exciting part for us, is hearing from you.
Well, and the only thing I just wanted to say is I saw a question in the Q&A asking if the chat could be available afterwards. And I think that would be a great idea, because one of the keys in combating burnout and demoralization is sharing this knowledge and drawing on existing funds of knowledge. And this is extraordinary what's being offered here. So I hope our organizers can we will definitely get one. And I hope that the organizers can find a way to make that happen.
Great. And I see that folks are offering ideas that are happening, again, not just at the building level, but at the school board level, maybe even at the LEA level. So again, these conversations and really asking, what are the ways that we are systematically institutionalizing the kinds of processes, practices that we know are emblematic of wellness, of care for each other. And I think that that's really where we are so excited that the conversation is going. There's a lot we've learned about being in this pandemic. And I think we hope that it's transformative to our conversation and not, stayed as part of our kind of immediate public health crisis, but one that can teach us something about moving forward. So let me just pose the last question as these continue to come in, because they're really exciting. Ways that SEL is being really embedded as part of district work, unpacking the framework. So the last question is really for decision makers. So if and we say that globally, if you identify as a decision maker of any kind, what will you do as a result of what you've learned, not really even just from us, but most importantly from the chat, the ways that this community of advocates and leaders is you're sharing with each other, what can we say we will do? What are the commitments? What small step are you willing to say that you will do come next week, come the beginning? I know we're heading into a holiday break, but come the new year. And that's anything from sharing some of this information and resources with a decision maker or colleague, to being willing to voice more confidently some of your ideas and strategies within your own teams. It can be advocating for one of these strategies that are being shared. So please feel free to add, and I'll call out a few things. Advocating and supporting teacher well-being. Yes, in every conversation, there likely is an opening one could make that continuing to advocate for educator well-being across the board is likely relevant in most of our conversations. Focus on self-improvement, make efforts to others to advocate. One of the things that we also have known and heard about is being willing to be vulnerable. So as a decision maker and leader, being willing to say, I don't actually have all the answers. I don't know. I would love to hear from you. I also am struggling. I also am stressed. Again, that validation and that sense that we are in this together. We have heard directly from educators say, it helps me. It helps me feel like we know why we're doing this. We are supporting each other. And I think that sometimes as leaders and decision makers in our own right, we struggle. We know when we work with young people and we've let young people know, hey, I'm actually feeling a little frustrated. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to give myself, I'm going to kind of walk outside, give myself a count to 10, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to try to start again. The fact that we can do not just shows what our social emotional skills and competencies are, we're modeling them and we're saying, hey, even I'm a human being. And so just making sure that those basic ways that we're role modeling for each other and being examples are extends to across the board to all leaders, to all of us as important examples. Doris, I want to make sure you've had a chance to see if there's anything you'd like to punctuate or highlight here.
You know, I have to be honest, I'm looking at two places and I'm absolutely excited about what I'm seeing come through in the chat. And there are also some questions in the Q&A that I was sort of organizing a bit. I just want to say, like, one of the things that I'm so excited about is that some people are talking about feeling rededicated to holding on to these ideas, or that they feel hopeful, because we have to have the belief, not in a toxic positivity kind of way,
right,
but in a way of being real and saying things are really challenging right now, right? Like my own daughter's school just went remote for 10 days because I live in the third highest county in the country right now in terms of caseloads. Things are hard, but what happens when we say what is the very most important thing? Not all things are equally important, and how do we commit to those? And one of the things we know is that we can't have schools without teachers there and educators there to do the work. And so how do we take care of our educators? And for me, that is incredibly, it's just heartening to see this level of dedication. We also know that it's hard to sell this. You know, the most recent Phi Delta Kappan State of the Schools poll showed that while educators are really recognizing in these COVID times that SEL is very important for students, parents are still really focused on the academics. And so to even take it further to say we need to focus on the well-being of educators, it's a hard sell, but we need to stay constant with that. One of the questions I wanted to ask, raise up, Olga, that
Sure.
that Sharon asked is, what are some examples of tiered approaches or strategies for comprehensive educator wellness? I feel like your center has really been working on that, and it would be great to be able to hear you speak a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So the brief that we'll make sure that you have from DC's Office of the State Office of Education offers some general thoughts on that. So meaning that if we were going to take a tier 1, 2, 3 sort of look, that that in their case, tier 1 would be considered those approaches or strategies where you're really thinking about the school culture, and you're really thinking about prevention, and in supporting the promotion and adoption of good coping skills as a school-wide, right? And so definitely there are, I'm sure, tools and actual concrete strategies through the CASEL guidance and through others, through climate work, through your SEL implementation. If you're using others, PBIS, those can all be a part of, all right, how are we address, when we do, mindfulness moments across the entire school community, and really making this a norm to say that let's all stop and breathe together. Let's all do this. Again, when it's done comprehensively as a part of a set of strategies, then I think it can be very effective. When we are piecemealing our approach, it can really feel like it's not taking a holistic look and can be less effective. A tier 2 can be thought of as building a focus on relationships and supports as a way, again, to mitigate. I sometimes think about what are the ways that we identify, what are the mechanisms to identify when we're worried about somebody? Are there ways that we can elevate? Who do we tell? Is it clear as a faculty member that if I'm worried about Doris, who do I, and I feel like I want to offer her some support. How do I guide her? Where would we go? Is it that the principal? Is that the head of the SST team? Do I have an outside community partner? Is there an agency? Is that clear to each other? Is there something that's documented that says, hey, if you see someone, if it's you, this is how you would elevate this concern to someone else who can offer you help. Do you know what your EAP policy is? So that's one way to think about a tier 2 approach. And then tier 3 is, can be considered both what are those things we're going to teach each other individually that we can think about as it relates to stress management, but even to crisis management. What do we do when any of us are in crisis? What is that crisis strategy that involves the adults in the building? I think we all know and have had to utilize, unfortunately, those plans for crisis management and response for our young people. But what does it mean? How do we apply that to the adults and the educators? And having spaces to have those conversations so that we can be proactively thinking about that. I have a chapter that hopefully will be coming out in a couple of months that, again, even as follow-up, I'll try to remember to send, that does say, hey, let's apply an MTSS approach to teacher well-being. And let's think about specifically the programs, practices, policies, and programs, I think I said that twice, and processes that can be brought to bear. There's one, and I'll give you an example. There's one question that I wanted to mention that I just saw a moment ago, which is, how do we address this? Let's see which person it was. How do we balance all of what's needed without putting more on teachers' plates? Teachers and educators, principals are asked to be many different things and play many different roles. Absolutely. So that's why much of the work we do is in understanding how good, effective school community partnerships can work. We don't think the solutions can be implemented effectively only thinking about the resources within a building and school hired resources. That really, what are the ways we have to think about those neighborhood, community, system-wide resources, and how we can fluidly utilize them? Are there partners that can be brought into the building? Are there connections that we can make? Can they be a part of any of our meetings, our strategy development? Not everything has to be within the building. We recognize the challenges of that, but I think I don't think that many of the solutions for the long term, given the complexity of these issues, can be addressed only thinking about the education system as the only system that's responsible for addressing them. We really have to think about the other systems involved. Other things that we want to say as we wrap up, we recognize there's about 3 minutes left and the chat's been very active. I'm excited.
I wanted to just, Ray had asked a question about how can we do this with no funding? How can we do some of these system-wide things with no funding? And I think that one of them is to make a commitment to that bi-directional communication and to make a commitment to working with teachers to develop or educators to develop solutions. This, and I have to tell you that teachers say that it's demoralizing when highly paid consultants roll in and do the work that they think they could do better. And so how do we draw upon educator expertise? And one very quick question that I would ask folks to think about and to ask their colleagues and themselves is, what makes my work good? What makes your work good? How can we figure out ways to do more of that so it sustains us and to let some of the other pieces drop away? We can't do it all. So how do we choose the pieces and focus on the pieces that sustain us and contribute to our well-being?